In 2022, Chairman Xi Jinping, the paramount leader of China, loudly proclaimed that China insists on striving for the prospect of peaceful reunification with Taiwan with the greatest sincerity and best efforts. But China will never promise to give up the use of force and reserves the option to take all necessary measures. Furthermore, Xi described the Taiwan issue as the Chinese people's own business, and it was up to the Chinese people to decide. In the same year, President Joe Biden was asked in a 60-minute interview broadcast if U.S. forces would defend the democratically governed island claimed by China, referring to Taiwan, and Joe Biden replied yes, in fact, if there was an unprecedented attack. When asked to clarify, Biden doubled down on his comment. Why are the two strongest military powers seemingly on a collision course over the small island of Taiwan? Why is China willing to use force to reunify with Taiwan? And why is the United States willing to put boots on the ground to fight and die on an island 7,600 miles away across the Pacific Ocean? My name is Vince Carter, and welcome to the VC3 podcast, where we talk about international relations, U.S. politics, and history. Today's episode is Let's Talk China, Taiwan. If you disagree with anything I have to say here, you can find all of my sources on screen and linked in the description below. I'm looking forward to a friendly yet challenging discussion in the comments. But first, here's a quick disclaimer. Let's dive right into it. But as always, we have to start with a little history for some vital context. In this case of China, there's a ton of history, so I'll try to narrow it down a bit for what's the most important. But if you aren't that interested in Chinese history or short on time, you can skip ahead using the chapters down below. For an in-depth video on the Chinese Civil War, check out my history series. After the fall of the Qing Empire and a brief stint with the Republican-style government, the once powerful state of China fragmented into various regions controlled by competing warlords. The warlord era, dated 1916 and 1928, was characterized by violence and heavy extraction of resources from society. Some of the warlords committed atrocities, allowing their troops to pillage and murder local communities while stealing considerable wealth from the peasantry through rents, tributes from landlords, taxes, money from criminal gangs, and revenues from the opium trade. The large amounts of wealth that the warlords were stealing and collecting could have gone to public goods, but instead, in large, it went to weapons of war, further cementing the power of the warlords. A long-term consequence of warlordism was the continued rise of military in Chinese society. The warlord era fundamentally undermined the concept of civilian rule in favor of the military providing solutions to control and governance. While some of the warlords attempted to conquer all of China, most of them mainly sought to dominate the regions they held within their control and fill their coffers until they overflowed. But there were two factions located in the southern provinces of China which sought to unite China under a single government and restore the power, not the empire, but to restore the power that once was held under the Qing government. The first major faction was the Kuomintang Party, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the KMT for short, which is what I'll be referring to them for the rest of this video, which was under the leadership of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The second major faction, though much smaller in size and influence at this point in time, was the Chinese Communist Party. While weaker than the KMT, the CCP did receive significant economic aid, military aid, and political training from the Soviet Union. The ideologies of both parties were formed by Chinese students and intellectuals who were frustrated with the current Confucian system, which had failed to combat Western imperialism during the century of humiliation. These students and intellectuals studied abroad, mainly during World War I, and brought back differing ideas back to China. In an effort to realize both parties' dreams of a united China, and after some pressure by Soviet Union on the CCP to unite with the KMT and the CCP joined forces, becoming what was called the United Front. The United Front had a government power sharing agreement and formed the National Revolutionary Army, where Chinese communists and nationalists fought side by side. In July 1926, joint CCP and KMT forces under the National Revolutionary Army launched the Great Northern Expedition against the Northern Province warlords. The war was a bitterly fought civil war, which took the lives of at least 300,000, including civilians. Once the National Revolutionary Army was on the cusp of victory, the KMT, under the orders of Chiang Kai-shek, betrayed the Chinese Communist Party and attempted to purge the party, government, and army of all communists through brutal campaigns and extermination and massacres. These purges eliminated all known and suspected communists from the party, from the cities under nationalist control, and pushed the CCP to the brink of destruction, forcing the remnants to seek refuge in the countryside of Xinjiang province. The KMT then implemented an encirclement campaign where they surrounded the communists and built a network of slowly advancing blockhouses and mud and brick outposts, all protected by machine gun fire. The fighting was vicious, leading to both sides suffering thousands of casualties, but by the summer of 1934, the CCP's army, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA for short, was being strangled to death by the KMT encirclement. In October 1934, with all hope lost, mounting losses, desertion growing, and supplies dwindling due to the blockade, the PLA attempted a desperate breakout of the encirclement, which was successful, but the CCP's long march had just begun. It was during this period of crisis that Mao Zedong rose to power and would lead the CCP and the PLA through the long march, gaining enormous fame and admiration. Once the CCP had broken out of the encirclement, they would be in constant retreat for over a year, marching more than 6,200 miles, traversing 11 provinces, crossing 5 major ridges, and fording numerous rivers. Of the initial 90,000 people who joined the Long March, only 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers survived. In October 1935, the Long March had finally ended when the remaining PLA troops reached a local Soviet area in northern Shinxi. While the KMT were conducting the encirclement campaigns against the PLA, the Japanese military began its invasion of China. In 1931, the Mukden incident occurred where the Japanese captured the most northern province of China, Manchuria, and pushed towards Beijing, reaching Hubei province in 1933. Eventually, in 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, initiated by Japan, would lead to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which would eventually merge with World War II. The Japanese aggression and annexation of long-held Chinese territory shifted the public perception of the Civil War to such a degree that Chinese people and the average KMT soldier saw the Japanese as the real threat to China, not the CCP. Chiang Kai-shek's officers grew frustrated at Chiang Kai-shek's unwillingness to view the Japanese as the main threat to China, which led to the Xi'an incident. A mutiny broke out, and General Sheng and a group of officers attacked the Generalissimo Chang's tent, killed his bodyguards, and then kidnapped the Generalissimo. General Sheng and the officers who took part in the mutiny demanded that Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek end the fighting against the CCP and create a second united front to confront the Japanese. In December 1936, the Chinese Civil War came to a halt, and the Second United Front was established to fight against the Japanese in what would eventually become World War II. The CCP was saved by General Sheng and by the unjustified Japanese aggression. The Second United Front differed from the First United Front in one important way. The PLA and the KMT would not fight as a single force. Instead, both armies would operate independently and fight the war in a way they saw fit. The KMT, now receiving military aid from the United States, would fight the Japanese in large-scale conventional-style battles, which resulted in the KMT suffering exceedingly large casualties, but tying down significant Japanese forces within the interior of China. The PLA, which was nearly destroyed by the KMT, decided not to engage the main Japanese forces in open battle due to its military inferiority. Instead, the PLA conducted guerrilla warfare, infiltrating rural areas behind Japanese lines, attacking rear troops, isolated troops, supply lines, coal mines, and infrastructure installations. The PLA only fought one major battle against the Japanese called the 100 Regiments Campaign, which reportedly resulted in the PLA taking over 100,000 casualties and their control over the regions being reduced by half. Long story short, the more the war waged on, the KMT continued to suffer catastrophic attrition rates, while the CCP was able to build up its strength and experience. In the final years of the war, the Second United Front between the CCP and the KMT had existed only on paper. Neither the CCP nor the KMT doubted that the Civil War would erupt in China after the defeat of the Japanese. At the onset of the continuation of the Chinese Civil War, the CCP's PLA was inferior in almost every way to the KMT. The KMT held some serious advantages, outnumbering the PLA by 3-1. It held air supremacy and possessed vastly superior quantities of tanks and heavy equipment, which were provided by the USA during World War II. It's important to note that during World War II, the US and the KMT's relationship had been deeply strained because of disagreements, so once the Chinese Civil War had resumed, the US initially had no plans of assisting the KMT in its struggle against the CCP. The Soviet Union also did not have any specific plans for what would occur once the Chinese Civil War kicked off. Chiang Kai-shek, seeking to press his advantage, struck first at the communists and rapidly conquered territory deep into northern China and Manchuria. Chiang Kai-shek's rapid conquest of vast amounts of territory stretched his army thin, a strategic mistake, which was compounded by tactical mistakes in crucial battles in late 1948. Mao and the PLA seized upon these mistakes and launched a devastating counterattack which pushed Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT government from Canton, then to Nanjing, and then to Chengdu, and finally in December in 1949 all the way to Taiwan, where the KMT, or the Republic of China, remains till this day. Since then, there have been about 4 major crises between the Republic of China and the PRC. The first 2 crises occurred in 1954 and 1958 and revolved around the PRC attempting to retake some of the small islands off the coast of mainland China that were held by the ROC forces. Ultimately, the United States sent naval and air forces into the Taiwanese Strait to deter the PRC from attempting to annex Taiwan through force. After the onset of the Korean War in 1950, which saw communist North Korea attack nationalist South Korea, the U.S. had decided that it was in U.S. strategic interest to stop further communist aggression and expansion, which now included Taiwan. In 1954, the U.S. and Taiwan signed a mutual defense agreement, which has been replaced with the 1978 Taiwan Relations Act, or the TRA. 2 of the 3 key provisions in the TRA cover Taiwan's security and state. The United States shall make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. 2. It is U.S. policy to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or any other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. This is what is being referred to when you hear U.S. politicians and military professionals talk about strategic ambiguity surrounding Taiwan. On one hand, the U.S. must maintain the capability to intervene if China attempts to annex Taiwan by force. But on the other hand, the U.S. is not legally bound to intervene and can choose to do so if the U.S. perceives the conflict as vital to its national security, which I promise we're going to get to. We're almost done with all this vital historical context. The third and fourth crisis, which occurred in 1995 through 1996 and 2022 through 2024, were fundamentally different from the first 2 crises in a few key ways. During the first 2 crises, the PRC learned a hard lesson. that in order to retake Taiwan, the PRC would very likely have to fight its way through the US military. In 1995 and 1996, the PRC's military was stronger than it was in the 1950s, but still no match for the global superpower of the US. So, when CCP leadership viewed Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui as moving towards democracy and independence and away from the one China policy, they decided to express their dissatisfaction with Taiwan and signal their willingness to use force by launching missile strikes around the island and conducting military drills practicing amphibious landings, mountain assaults, and paratrooper exercises. The One China policy is an agreement between the US and the PRC that states the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. But in this agreement, the US did not specifically give in to Chinese demands that it recognizes Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. The US simply acknowledged the PRC position that Taiwan is part of China, which is the same position as the ROC. But nor does the US recognize the ROC as an independent sovereign state. In 2022, the PRC again expressed its dissatisfaction with Taiwan when Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and in 2024 when Taiwan's President William Lai was inaugurated. While the reaction was similar to the 1990s, launching of missiles and holding military drills, the capability of the PLA from 1990 to the 2020s has drastically increased. 3 days after President William Lai gave his inauguration speech, the PLA commenced a large-scale exercise surrounding Taiwan called Joint Sword 2024, which over the course of 3 days had over 146 PLAF aircraft and 46 planned vessels simulating a naval blockade of the island, conducting strikes against high-value military targets, and a quarantine by Chinese Coast Guard vessels around smaller islands controlled by Taiwan. The fourth Taiwan Strait crisis has demonstrated that the PLA very likely assesses it has the capability to at least contest the waters surrounding Taiwan, whereas before the US had dominated the strait at will. Man, that was a shit ton of history to cover, so let's quickly summarize the main points. Number 1. The CCP views the Chinese Civil War as an unsettled conflict since a peace treaty or an armistice was never formally signed. Furthermore, the CCP views Taiwan as a rogue province instead of an independent nation. Therefore, the CCP views Taiwan as an internal matter that foreign nations should stay out of. Furthermore, review of the most authoritative Chinese party states' statements and high-level party documents conducted by CSIS found that the high-level party documents and statements most clearly refer to a timeline for reunification with Taiwan by linking reunification to the goal of national rejuvenation, which is to be achieved by 2049. Essentially, reunification with Taiwan is fundamental to the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. 2. The ROC, which initially began as a military dictatorship, ended martial law in 1987 and held its first direct democratic presidential election in 1996. So today, Taiwan is a fully functioning democracy which respects human rights, the rule of law, and views itself as fundamentally different from the CCP, but has not outright declared independence because of the fear of invasion from the CCP. 3. The US has had a long history of assisting the ROC in its efforts to defend against a PRC invasion. In the early years of the Cold War, the US believed that if the PRC conquered Taiwan, then the Soviet Union would be able to use its strategic position. Now that the Cold War is over, the same logic applies, but to the PRC. And the US has chosen strategic ambiguity in order to ensure the status quo of the One China policy. Essentially, the modern-day US has been playing a balancing act, supporting Taiwan as a de facto independent state, but ensuring that Taiwan does not outright declare independence, crossing the CCP's red line and igniting a regional and likely global war. 4. The PLA of today has been modernized to such a degree that the CCP very likely assesses that it can at least challenge the US within the Straits of Taiwan. Thus, the CCP is emboldened to react to Taiwanese expressions of freedom with large-scale military exercises, military aggression, and does not renounce the use of force to reunify with the island. Now that we've covered the fundamental understanding of the historical context surrounding Taiwan, China, and the US, I want to quickly revisit why China is a threat before we move on to Taiwan's strategic importance. In my two-part series called The Chinese Threat, I made the argument that China is the greatest existential threat to US national security and the rules-based international order. Under US leadership in partnership with our democratic allies, the rules-based international order has secured an era that is the most economically prosperous, has the lowest proportion of deaths caused from war, and has the greatest number of democracies protecting fundamental human rights in the history of humanity. All of this is threatened by China's domestic actions, aggressive military behavior, and global ambitions. Ultimately, China seeks to hijack the rules-based international system and replace the US as the global leader and replace Western liberal values with Sino-centric values to create a global system that is anti-democratic, hostile to human rights, friendly to authoritarian regimes like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and most importantly, places China at the center of decision-making. A system which threatens the peace, prosperity, and fundamental rights that so many people fought and died to secure. I think it's important that we keep all of this in mind, because if we do not hold what is at stake in the forefront of our minds, we will be aimlessly discussing nothing. Now that we have both the fundamental understanding of the historical context surrounding Taiwan, China, and the US, and we have a common understanding of the threat China poses to the US and the rules-based international order, let's discuss why this beautiful little island is absolutely vital to US national security. At its closest point, Taiwan sits roughly 80 miles off the eastern shoreline of China. Taiwan's geographical position places it at the center of the first island chain, which runs from Japan down to Taiwan, through the Philippines, and curls into Indonesia and Malaysia. This string of islands is naturally occurring geographic boundary that restricts China's freedom of movement into the Pacific, enables US and partners' ability to monitor Chinese movements, acts as a shield protecting US basing in the region and the flanks of US allies, and limits Chinese economic and physical growth necessary to achieve regional and global hegemony. In 1950, General Douglas MacArthur wrote a top-secret memorandum on Formosa, or Taiwan, explaining why he was convinced that the strategic interests of the United States will be in serious jeopardy if Taiwan is allowed to be dominated by a power hostile to the United States. In this memorandum, he famously called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier and a submarine tender, and he could not have been more right. One of the CCP's stated goals is to be a global superpower that can project power across the globe like the US. In order to do this, the CCP needs to modernize the People's Liberation Army Navy, or the Plan for short, into a blue water navy, or a navy that can travel, sustain, and fight in any ocean around the world. One of the Plan's deadliest weapons are its nuclear submarines equipped with nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. The Type 094 Jin-class SSBN is equipped with 12 missile tubes, each capable of firing the JL-2 missile, which each can carry up to 3 nuclear warheads up to 4,500 miles away. The new Type 096, which is projected to be in service for the Plan by 2030, is expected to be armed with the JL-3 SLBM, which is estimated to have a range greater than 6,200 miles and also carrying 3 nuclear warheads. Additionally, the Type 096 is expected to be a significant jump in technology and more numerous and more stealthy, and may range over a wider area than the Type 094, making it much more difficult for the US and its allies to keep track of. These submarines are intended to be stealthy, lurking off the coast of the US at any time, ready to strike when they receive the call. But because of the geography of the first island chain limiting access to the Pacific, the plan must traverse through specific choke points in order to get access to the Pacific. Working from north to south along the first island chain, we can identify that the most direct and easiest routes to navigate into the Pacific are the Miyako and the Luzon Strait, both controlled by U.S. allies, enabling the U.S. and its partners to monitor and track any and all vessels traveling through these choke points. Going around Taiwan would appear to be the most reasonable route into the Pacific, but missiles based on islands around Taiwan and on Taiwan can easily close any gap the plan might attempt to travel through, and in the event of war, denying the plan from exiting waters close to PRC shores. The Miyako Gap is a 155-mile gap that sits between Miyako and Okinawa, Japan, and is the largest gap within the northern portion of the first island chain. If the plan attempted to cross the gap, they would have to potentially deal with Taiwanese Haisung Fang 3 anti-ship missiles with a range of 185 miles, U.S. Tomahawk missiles with a range of 115 miles, the Harpoon Block 2 missile with a range of 410 miles, and the newly arrived Japanese Type 12 with a range of 560 miles. To the south of Taiwan is the Luzon Strait with a similar size gap of 160 miles. In the event of war, any planned fleet would have to deal with the same exact situation. U.S. and Allied forces can use these anti-ship missiles to close these critical gaps, caging in the PLA to its shores in the event of war. Additionally, these gaps allow the U.S. and Allied forces to monitor and track the plan's deadly submarines, essentially negating their element of surprise and allowing U.S. vessels to trail and engage them if necessary. Therefore, if a planned submarine wants to remain undetected and launch their nuclear payload, they need to fire from within the first island chain. Looking at the graphic on screen, we have a notional planned nuclear submarine. It could be the Type 094 or the Type 096, targeting Pearl Harbor, Anchorage, and LA and the associated ranges. The current JL-2 missile with a maximum of 4,500 miles, which is used by the Type 094, cannot effectively engage any target, whereas the upcoming JL-3 nuclear missile with a range of 6,200 miles could potentially reach Pearl Harbor and Anchorage. But even if a shot is taken from within the first island chain, the U.S. ballistic missile defense system within the region would then have the best opportunity to find, fix, track, target, and engage that missile before it lands at its designated target. Without the first island chain, the U.S. BMDS would lose critical time and space necessary to protect the U.S. homeland from ballistic missile attacks, either nuclear or conventional. This BMDS graphic depicts the various sensors and engagement methods designed to intercept a missile at various portions of its flight. The greater the shot distance equates to more time for the BMDS to work through the kill chain and engage that missile long before it reaches the U.S. Additionally, the loss of the first island chain results in the U.S. losing the ability to cage in the plan to its shores. If the CCP had control over Taiwan, all of these critical advantages would be completely negated. The integrity of the first island chain would be destroyed. The plan would have unfettered access to the Pacific Ocean, forcing the U.S. to fall back on the second island chain, which has large gaps and holes, making it much more difficult for the U.S. and its allies to track and monitor the plan and the deadly nuclear-capable submarines. U.S. citizens would have to get used to living in a world where planned ships frequently operate off the coast of the United States. The first island chain keeps the plan bottled up, an advantage the U.S. cannot afford to lose. In 2021, Assistant Secretary of Defense Isle Rather described Taiwan to Congress as being located at the critical node within the first island chain, anchoring a network of U.S. allies and partners that is critical to the region's security and critical to the defense of vital U.S. interests. If the U.S. allows the PRC to annex Taiwan, it will drastically alter the strategic picture in the region by driving a wedge between U.S. allies, giving up the flanks of our defense treaty allies, Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea, and effectively pushing the U.S. out of the region. World War II taught the U.S. that a deeply integrated alliance that shares intelligence, shares the burden of cost of production, and fights as a unified force wins wars against the strongest of aggressors. The United States' greatest asymmetrical advantage over the PRC is its alliance system within the region. On the flip side, one of the PRC's greatest asymmetrical advantages over the US is the tyranny of distance. The US must travel over 7,600 miles to reinforce forces within the region. This means that if a war kicks off over Taiwan, the US and allied forces already forward positioned within the theater will be on their own for a significant amount of time. U.S. allies Japan and the Philippines are over 1,000 miles apart, while the U.S. base on Okinawa, which is strategically important both geographically and militarily, sits 373 miles from mainland Japan and 690 miles from the Philippines. A friendly controlled Taiwan acts as a shield, keeping Chinese forces at bay, ensuring freedom of movement along sea lines of communications, and ensuring close coordination for the U.S. and its allies. By controlling Taiwan, the PLA would be able to drive a physical wedge between the Philippines and Japan, which would disrupt effective coordinated operations between the Philippines, Japan, and the United States in the event of war. This would be a significant advantage for the PRC, given joint operations, already difficult to conduct properly, will now be conducted by geographically isolated allies, adding to the difficulty. The loss of Taiwan would make this difficult situation even worse. PRC forces' forward position on Taiwan would significantly challenge the freedom of movement along sea lines of communications between the U.S. forces and its allies, place U.S. and allied forces stationed in the region, and specifically on Okinawa, at extreme peril, and effectively push U.S. forces out of the region. For the sake of the length of this video, which is already long, I'm only going to cover the wave tops of the PLA capabilities, starting with the PLA Air Force, or the PLAF, and air and ground-based air defenses. The first graphic on screen is the current notional force posture of the PLAF without control of Taiwan. The large range ring indicates the combat radius, the maximum distance an aircraft can travel, engage in combat, and return to base, of the PLAF J-20 Mighty Dragon and the J-16 Hidden Dragon. The small range ring indicates the maximum range of the HQ-22, which is a surface-to-air missile system designed to protect fixed targets, concentration of friendly troops, or deny specific air corridors to an adversary. Chinese aircraft willing to take a risk can challenge U.S. forces and coalition aircraft halfway to the second island chain, but are far from ground-based air defense cover. The next graphic on screen is a notional force posture of the PLA with full control of Taiwan. Chinese aircraft can now challenge U.S. and coalition forces nearly all the way out to the second island chain, and can land at airfields on Taiwan if their fuel gauges are low or if they're seeking immediate protection. Next, turning to the People's Liberation Army Rocket Forces, or the PLARF, and the PLAN Forces, our three most outer range rings, working from the largest to the smallest, are the DF-26, the DF-21, and the DF-16, which are ground-based ballistic missiles intended to strike military bases, airfields, while the DF-26 and 21 can also target aircraft carriers. The three smaller range rings indicate the maximum range of the land-based anti-ship missiles, the YJ-18, which is designed to do just that, sink ships. The land-based ballistic missiles along with land-based anti-ship missiles are highly concentrated within the first island chain, while the DF-26 can potentially strike targets as far as the Guam. This next graphic on screen is a notional force posture if the PLARF and PLAN are able to set up their missiles on Taiwan. PLARF land ballistic missile systems will no longer just dominate the first island chain, but will also dominate the second island chain. PLAN anti-ship missiles positioned on Taiwan's coast will act as a shield protecting China from any naval vessels attempting to traverse the Taiwan Strait, the Miyako Gap, and the Luzon Strait. The next graphic on screen is the combined notional picture of a PLA-controlled Taiwan. The combined effects of the Chinese military capabilities forward deployed on Taiwan will allow the Chinese military to dominate the second island chain. PRC aircraft and ballistic missiles will be able to easily target U.S. bases on Okinawa and Guam, placing the bases at extreme peril. U.S. and coalition forces attempting to reinforce and resupply the bases will have to fight through concentric layers of air and sea defense, essentially denying the U.S. freedom of movement within the region. This strategy is called anti-axis aerial denial, or A2AD, and if achieved over Taiwan, the U.S. will be denied the ability to sustain bases in the region and denied access within the second island chain. If China annexes Taiwan, then the United States would be shut out of the region, forced to fall back to the second island chain, leaving our defense treaty allies isolated and ceding the entire Indo-Pacific region to the Chinese. If the Chinese decide to pursue the U.S. across the Pacific, the next conflict would be at our borders and on our doorstep. Here's a little more optimistic assessment from the Council on Foreign Relations. With Taiwan outside the control of China and U.S. allies and partners arrayed throughout the first island chain, China's military will struggle to project power far beyond China's shores. However, if China were to annex Taiwan and base military assets such as underwater surveillance devices, submarines, and air defense units on the island, it would be able to limit the U.S. military operations in the region and subsequently its ability to defend its Asian allies. With Taiwan under China's control, it would be far more difficult for the United States to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific or prevent a Chinese bid for regional dominance. Not only would a PRC control drive a physical wedge between U.S. allies, disrupting effective coordinated operations and push the U.S. out of the region, but it would also threaten the flanks of U.S. defense treaty allies, the Philippines and Japan. Many Americans forget that America's entry into World War II wasn't solely due to the attack on Pearl Harbor, but was also due to the simultaneous Japanese invasion of U.S.-controlled Philippines, which originated from Taiwan. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched Zeros from Taiwan that destroyed B-17 bombers and other key military assets at Clark Field. About 180 miles away at the same time, Japanese General Hisashi Teraichi conducted the amphibious invasion of the Philippines from Taiwan with 4 corps, starting with Bataan Island. In 1944 through 1945, when the balance of forces had shifted against the Japanese and U.S. carrier forces were advancing into the Western Pacific, Taiwan played a crucial role for the Japanese as a staging point for troops, air reinforcements being deployed to defend the Philippines, and overall Taiwan was significant in the role of defense of scheme for the Japanese. In 1945, in preparation for the invasion of mainland Japan, the U.S. invaded Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands at large and captured it using the islands as a staging ground. Following history as a guide, the PRC could use Taiwan as a stepping stone for an invasion of Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands, thus exposing mainland Japan's southern flank or soft underbelly to invasion. As General MacArthur stated, the military utility of Taiwan is sharply underlined by the fact that Japan in 1941 controlled not only the Ryukyus, but the entire eastern periphery of China. This history bears on why the Philippines and Japan are concerned about Taiwan becoming a base of operations for an aggressive, large, and hostile neighbor. Not only would the PRC-controlled Taiwan drive a wedge between U.S. allies, push the U.S. out of the region, and threaten the flanks of U.S. defense treaty allies, it would also have serious economic consequences for the globe. Some of the dire economic consequences include the PRC cutting off a U.S. trading partner, having direct control over critical global shipping lanes, and dominating the advanced semiconductor market. Taiwan is the world's 16th largest trading economy, with a GDP of US $669 billion, and having imported and exported $922 billion in goods and services in 2021. Taiwan is the United States' 8th largest trading partner, and the United States is Taiwan's 2nd largest trading partner, exceeding US $90.6 billion in trade with the United States annually. U.S. exports of goods and services to Taiwan supported an estimated 188,000 American jobs in 2019. While losing Taiwan as a trading partner wouldn't be a catastrophic loss to the U.S. economy, it would absolutely have a significant impact on the average U.S. person, and especially those whose jobs are directly tied to activity with Taiwan. Taiwan also sits at one of the most strategic straits in the world for global trade. The Taiwan Strait is the primary route for ships passing from China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to points west, carrying goods from Asian factory hubs to the markets in Europe, the US, and all points in between. Nearly half of the global container fleet and close to 90% of the largest container ships by tonnage transit through the Taiwan Strait, making it one of the world's most vital waterways. A 2024 study conducted by the UK Office of National Statistics examined 6 global maritime passages between January 2022 and April 2024, and it found that the Taiwan Strait and the Strait of Dover were the busiest of the 6 analyzed maritime passages, with cargo ships accounting for the largest portion of ships, 60% for Taiwan. Roughly 1,200 ships cross the strait per week. If the PRC had full control of Taiwan, they could hold global shipping and critical supply chains as leverage over the globe. Furthermore, U.S. defense treaty allies Japan and South Korea are highly dependent on the Taiwanese Strait and the sea lines of communication surrounding the island. South Korea, the 14th largest economy in the globe and the U.S. 7th largest trading partner, relies heavily on shipping routes for its exports and imports. More than 90% of Korea's maritime trade volume passes through the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. Additionally, South Korea relies on imports to meet almost 98% of its fossil fuel consumption because of insufficient domestic resources. Because it has no international oil or natural gas pipelines, South Korea relies on tanker shipments of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and crude oil to meet demand. Roughly 70% of these critical energy imports travel from the Middle East through the South China Sea and ultimately through the Taiwan Strait to reach South Korea. The Taiwanese Strait is also a Japanese maritime lifeline. Japan receives 90% of its oil imports, 99% of its mineral resources, and 100% of its nuclear fuel needs from ships that travel across the sea lines surrounding the Taiwanese Strait. According to a PLA internal document titled the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, which was published by the Beijing Military Academy, states, after Taiwan is reunified with mainland China, Japan's maritime lines of communication will fall completely within striking ranges of China's fighters and bombers. If we can reduce Japan's raw imports by 15 to 20%, it will be a heavy blow to the Japanese economy. After imports have been reduced by 30%, Japan's economic activity and war-making potential will be basically destroyed. After 50%, Japan's national economy and war-making potential will collapse entirely, and can even create a famine within the Japanese islands. I couldn't find the original document for the source, so take this quote with a grain of salt. But take these figures and compare them to the 2022 Reuters report and to this graph on screen produced by the World Bank, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and Vortexa, and we can see that the numbers are pretty spot on. A PRC-controlled Taiwan will give China extreme leverage over Japan and South Korea, putting both nations' vital imports and energy security at extreme risk. China could use this leverage to force both nations to accept China as a new regional hegemon, or potentially suffer a blockade that could starve out both nations. The final economic consideration that we need to examine is Taiwan's semiconductor industry. Nearly 70% of the total and 90% of the most sophisticated and advanced semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan. Semiconductors are critical components for cars, cell phones, advanced computers, and vital to U.S. military hardware such as missiles, aircraft, AI, and quantum computers. No other company can produce chips at scale as sophisticated as those manufactured by TSMC. The United States is highly dependent on semiconductors produced in Taiwan at TSMC. For instance, Apple's most advanced semiconductors, which contains billions of transistors, can only be produced in a single building within TSMC's sprawling complex in Taiwan. According to a 2023 United States International Trade Commission report titled U.S. Exposure to Taiwan's Semiconductor Industry, this report estimates that at the segment level, about 44.2% of U.S. imports of logic chips were manufactured in Taiwan, compared to 24.4% of memory chips and 1% of analog chips. And based on the current estimated capacity constraints in the United States, domestic production of logic chips could only increase as high as about 5%, and thus could only partially replace the reduced imports from Taiwan. In simple language, if the PRC were allowed to annex Taiwan and able to assume control of an undestroyed TMSC and the other semiconductor facilities, the PRC could deny the U.S. the most advanced semiconductors, potentially erasing the technological gap the U.S. military has held over the PLA, or at worst, leading to the U.S. military being technologically inferior. 2. It could also potentially utilize the most advanced semiconductors in the world to increase the technological capabilities of the PRC. Additionally, the PRC would have significant economic leverage over the U.S. because of the numbers of semiconductors that are used in regular civilian products, such as Apple, which we talked about. If the U.S. wishes to maintain its technological superiority over the Chinese military in the long run, it's absolutely important that the factories at TMSC do not fall into the hands of the CCP. The final reason why Taiwan must not be allowed to be annexed by the PRC is that Taiwan is a full-fledged democracy. This is both a moral and strategic argument. In 1949, the nationalist government fled to Taiwan and declared martial law over the island. The KMT, a dictatorial military regime, oppressed civil and political rights on the island in fear of the communists organizing an uprising on Taiwan. In the name of national security and in order to secure its regime, the nationalists committed atrocities against its own people. From 1949 to 1990, the nationalist government killed at least somewhere between 21,000 to 38,000 people and imprisoned at least 140,000 people. Chiang Kai-shek famously said he would rather mistakenly kill 1,000 people than allow one communist to escape. This period of time has become known as the White Terror. In 1987, roughly 10 years after Chiang Kai-shek's death, martial law was finally lifted from the island. Taiwan had a rocky transition to democracy, but had its first democratic presidential election in 1996. Today, 23.43 million people in Taiwan enjoy a fully functioning democracy that respects human rights and the rule of law and has an open economy that has brought economic prosperity to the island. Allowing 23.43 million democratic-loving people to be conquered by an authoritarian regime which will oppress them and strip them of all of their political and civil rights is a moral issue. Strategically speaking, if the U.S. allows the PRC to annex Taiwan, a peaceful democracy, it will signal to the world that conquest through violent means is acceptable. It's the new global norm, and it will embolden U.S. adversaries such as Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The security of the globe will be threatened. As stated before, the U.S. learned a hard lesson from World War II that alliances win wars, and today the U.S. alliance system represents the greatest asymmetrical advantage the U.S. has over the PRC. As stated elegantly by Luke P. Pelocci, writing on behalf of the U.S. Army War College. The bottom line is that the loss of Taiwan to PRC control will be seen as a signal by allies and partners that the United States can no longer run the show in the Pacific and is unable to maintain a rules-based order in the Pacific, potentially leading to U.S. allies being sucked in the PRC's economic and security orbit, isolating the U.S. and degrading its greatest advantage. The loss of Taiwan would be a travesty for democracy, damage U.S. credibility, and would very likely force U.S. allies to side with the PRC, destroying the U.S. greatest asymmetrical advantage over the PRC. This is a moral and a strategic issue. The strategic implications of Taiwan on U.S. national security are enormous. 1. Taiwan is the centerpiece of the first island chain, which enables the U.S. and its partners to track and monitor deadly PRC submarines which seek to remain hidden in order to threaten the U.S. with nuclear ballistic missiles. 2. It cages in the PLA Navy, keeping it far from U.S. shores. 3. Taiwan acts as a shield, protecting the U.S.'s ability to base and access the region. Otherwise, the U.S. would be pushed out. Additionally, it protects U.S. Defense Treaty allies and their exposed flanks. And it also protects vital sea lines of communications, enabling effective coordination between coalition partners in the event of war. 4. A U.S.-friendly Taiwan protects one of the globe's most vital shipping lanes from being dominated by the PRC and potentially being used to strangle U.S. allies, Japan and South Korea. The loss of Taiwan would cut off one of the U.S.'s trading partners, directly affecting the U.S. economy and at least 188,000 American jobs. 5. The loss of Taiwan would also damage U.S. credibility with our allies, very likely forcing them to decide between fighting China alone or joining China's sphere of influence. 6. Allowing an authoritarian regime to gobble up a peaceful democratic nation will signal to U.S. adversaries such as Russia, Iran, and North Korea that they are free to conquer whichever nations they choose, that the rules-based international order that the U.S. and its allies set up post-World War II, that so many men and women have died to defend, no longer exists. If we do not wish to place our national security into the hands of the very people who wish to destroy it, the CCP, then the United States must be willing to act swiftly and decisively, committing boots on the ground and ships at sea in defense of any invasion of Taiwan. I hope these arguments have been enough to persuade you, and if you disagree, I would love to hear why in the comments so we can have a civil yet stimulating discussion. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Let's Talk China.